Now that I think about it, fantasy is just conservatism wrapped in an enchanted bow, and you cannot convince me otherwise. Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Luna, and today I wanted to rant about men who ultimately ruin the genre of fantasy. However, I changed my mind. Instead, I want to talk about the fantasy to alt-right pipeline that young men often find themselves on. I might make a video looking at this through the lens of femcels later down the line, but for now, we're just going to look at this through the lens of male incels. The TLDR of the video is that due to fantasy acting as a form of escapism, it makes it very easy for readers to be indoctrinated into one line of thinking, or the other. And due to fantasy typically being set in medieval times where conservatism was the norm, readers are often educated in the benefits of conservative and patriarchal thinking, which ultimately leads into the alt-right pipeline. Also, writers themselves could also just be conservative pricks. This is concerning because of the number of people who like fantasy, and often many of them are young men. And this is ultimately even more horrific because these boys eventually turn into full-blown incels unless somebody intervenes. This is not just a fantasy problem. It is, in fact, a fiction problem, but that is a video for another day. For the video, I'm going to be discussing books and TV shows, as the genre of fantasy has gotten quite accessible, being found in comics, movies, TV shows, books, video games. And for the sake of making my job easier, I'll be sticking to strictly talking about books and TV shows for my examples. Every fantasy lover has their favorite piece of media. Unfortunately, some of these favorites are really bad for the development of the morals of the average boy, as there is always some form of prejudice in the novels or harmful stereotypes of some indigenous group of people that mirrors a race of people in our own world. And though this can be done really well, allowing for the reader to be able to comprehend the struggles of those different groups, it unfortunately is not always done well, and most of the time it simply appears as if the writer and the protagonist are mocking this group of people or are actively benefiting and thereby enjoying these groups of people's oppressions. This usually happens when there seems to be a lack of nuance in the perception of this group of people in world, or more likely the writer themselves is simply a bigot. We see this in media like Harry Potter, where there is a clear mirror to real-life events such as the Holocaust, but due to the writer's very own bigotry, the work is polluted with harmful stereotypes of Jewish people represented in the form of goblins, not to mention the awful woman's characterization of people of color, especially when it came to names. Now, the specific crime I was alluding to earlier was that she made a slave race. The Harry Potter series is the perfect example of fantasy media that allows for hatred to brew inside the mind of the young. Most people who have read the book sympathize with Dobby and would have eventually pondered how black people in the world felt about the elf's existence and the elf race existence. But there are so many questions like that that have been ignored for the sake of the plot. Mind you, the plot of Harry Potter could have been elevated if she had decided to delve deeper into the issues of the elves, but she did not, leaving the reader with unanswered questions and the loose idea of slaves liking to be slaves, which is weird because the target audience of these books are in fact 11-year-olds and up. Others are also good examples of such poor moralization in fantasy, such as The Wheel of Time. Every single female character acts as nothing more than footnotes in the adventures of Rand al'Thor. But there are some examples of the inverse, such as A Wizard of Earthsea, where they delve into such topics and the issues of classicism and the fine line between religions and cults and answering the big questions while still being fun for the average reader. There is a clear correlation between the pieces of media that a fantasy lover grows up with and their overall behavior later on in life. Unfortunately, most media that caters to young men does lead them down a dark path, one filled with hate and bitterness. It is a known fact that the media one consumes impacts how one perceives the world. Literature and TV shows are simply tools of propaganda, whether one likes to admit it or not. Over time, they will steer you into one direction of thinking or the other. The issue only comes in when the propaganda you are being fed is about hate. Most pieces of literature and modern films will always preach about having empathy for others, being compassionate to all. regardless of economic background, race, sexuality, or gender identity. This is considered good propaganda because it teaches morality and steers people to love thy neighbor. But bad propaganda is just as common. Just look at the Daily Wire. These pieces of media can influence the way one interacts with someone different from them. Look at how different religious texts influence how different religions act. Mormons don't drink coffee and are most likely racist due to the legend of how black people were created. Christians believe that all other religions are false and typically have complicated relationships with non-believers. Now, regardless of what religion you personally believe, you can clearly see the power of the written word. And unfortunately, if all you have consumed in your life are stories of men with God complexes, any Brandon Sanderson book, or that treat women like disposable sex toys, most books written by men in the 2000s in the genre, and treats the concept of being queer as a mental disability, queer people do not exist in majority of fantasy media, period. It has only become a recent thing for them to be included or have stories centered in them. And no, I'm not looking at allegories because queer people deserve to be on page and on screen in their full glory. You are most likely going to be indoctrinated into the alt-right pipeline. Most fantasy books and films fail the Bechdel test miserably. What is the Bechdel test? When two women who are both given names have a conversation with each other that does not pertain to a man, this test should be pretty easy to pass. However, you would be wrong. Not even feminist masterpieces such as Mulan, I use the term feminist masterpiece loosely there, Mulan doesn't pass the test. This test ultimately reveals the lack of representation of women in media. As why is it that a woman have to have their own stories reduced to their relationship with a man? Now, this is its own tangent, but it relates to the alt-right pipeline, as when young men only see women in their favorite media as tools for the advancement of the story of the main protagonist that is a man, all of a sudden women are relegated to nothing burgers, and it gives men the weird sense that their lives are more important than women around them. These types of thoughts further ingrain misogynistic thoughts in the brain of the average man, leading to far worse and far more sexist beliefs as they get older, because it always starts with Hermione as an annoying know-it-all and turns into Hermione as a two-timing bitch who can't ever shut up. Over time, the aggression increases, only getting worse with the rampant puberty changes that make teenage boys unstable and emotionally volatile. There is a reason why teenage boys tend to be the prime target audience for alt-right podcasts and political influences. They're easily manipulated due to the emotional instability, which can be the reason why when the emotionally volatile child reads stories where women caught kissing a man or called whores might hurt their perception of women as a whole. All fantasy novels, even the newer ones, like to use misogyny as plot drivers, and typically they don't do good jobs of using it because the protagonists never actually fight against it. They simply subvert the expectations of one woman and make them not like the other girls, and often add bullshit that attempts to make misogyny sound like a good idea. Now, yes, you should be able to tell fiction apart from reality, but the policing of women's sexual desires is an ideology of alt-right extremists, and it's an ideology that they hold near and dear to their heart. Fiction mimics reality, and reality sometimes mimics fiction. These books that fail the Bechdel test further push the narrative of women being less than and are undeserving of autonomy, whether or not they mean to, which can further indoctrinate them into the alt-right pipeline. But other tropes only add fuel to the fire, such as the trope of chosen ones in media. This, accompanied by the lack of good representation of women in fantasy media, further fosters the idea that men are far more important than women, that men are superior to women. Now, yes, sometimes this trope is beautifully and allows for a good storytelling, but sometimes it's simply not executed well enough. There is a formula to writing chosen one stories. He or she is often given a prophecy or destiny at birth or at a young age, and then they spend a good chunk of their lives preparing for it by either attending a magic school or going on missions with their friends. At some point, the chosen one is forced to abandon all of their friends for their own sake and do everything alone, only to realize that doing everything alone is not the answer. The issue with this trope is in some fantasy media is that message of it's okay to share your burdens is usually skimmed past very quickly or completely left out. meaning it is less likely to stick in the brain of the average young adult. A good chosen one story is rare, but again, they are good. They are captivating, but again, they are rare. At some point, you will find yourself reading a lot of chosen one stories, right? Because the average fantasy-loving kid will have consumed 10 of these stories in the last 3 years alone, which does not seem like a lot, but when you are young and you are barely able to finish one fantasy novel, which is like roughly 400 pages in 2 months, it is in fact a lot. In the alt-right pipeline, there is this common ideology of toxic masculinity that is shared. A man must be strong, emotionless. He must be better than everyone around him and carry the weight of the world on his shoulders because showing emotions could make him weak or, God forbid, gay. The chosen one trope can lead young men down this pipeline as when one views themselves in the eyes of the hero who let go of everything for the sake of the world, they began to idealize the stoic sadness, and ultimately it leads them to be weak and to be emotionally immature. Poorly done tropes and bad representation in fiction, where conservatism runs rampant and the issues where classism and religion and racism are barely discussed, are all factors in the descent of fantasy lovers into the alt-right pipeline. But the lack of queer representation is just another nail in the indoctrination coffin. The lack of queer representation in fantasy often leads to young men not being able to empathize with the struggles of queer people in real life. Yes, fantasy novels are not supposed to be a guideline for morality, but with the amount of conservatism propaganda this genre is drenched in, it could do the very least of trying to demonize some of said propaganda and add queer people being happy and healthy. Representation matters because it helps queer people feel more accepted, more human, more like they are just normal people, because that is what they are. But lack of representation creates a sense of otherness. We are this hushed secret that cannot exist in fantastical worlds, where dragons exist and elves can fall in love with dwarves. We do not exist. And that leads one to question, does the writer wish we did not exist outside of the written page? Queer young men are capable of entering the alt-right pipeline, but their introduction to the pipeline is more focused on their self-hatred and internalized homophobia than their straight counterparts. They cannot see themselves as the heroes or even friends with the heroes because more often than not, their personality traits are often given to the villains. Look at half of all the Disney villains. The male ones are these men with long hair and extravagant robes, or they have a dramatic mannerisms that can be identified as queer adjacent. The prime examples being Jafar and Scar. This contrasts with their straight counterparts who enter the pipeline because they want to find a sense of self in whatever community tells them they are already the perfect version of themselves, that tells them that everybody else is the problem and gives them an outlet or a scapegoat to misplace their anger on. Now, representation matters, but there's one group of people we do not need represented in fantasy media: Nazis. Most fantasy media feature the concept of pure bloodlines, which creates the trope of Nazis existing in the fantasy world, just because. This is, in fact, weird, because there will be writers actively finding magical reasons why two groups of consenting adults cannot have children. There is no benefit to breeding for the sake of perfect offspring, which is, in fact, eugenics, and it is wrong because it leads to the eventual point of controlling who can have kids with and with whom they are allowed to have kids. This concept tends to become very ableist and racist. There is quite literally a link to the concept and full-on neo-Nazis. Unfortunately, the concept of pure bloodlines is in a lot of fantasy media, mostly because the idea of keeping bloodlines pure is old rhetoric of kings, pharaohs, and even emperors from an ancient time, where whose blood flowed in whose veins decided whether or not there could be a war. But this concept in media such as D&D, Harry Potter, and Steven Universe, and yes, one could ultimately argue that the fantasy media that I have mentioned ultimately critique this way of thinking. But kids are dumb, and I fear we do not drive home the point that being a Nazi is bad enough. We don't do it enough. And yes, we could go on and on about media literacy, but let's be honest now. The collective IQ of our planet has gone down. Look at the film Wicked. Most people are so hyper-focused on the BS that is the love life of characters, which is a subplot, that they fail to appreciate the intricate comparison of the film had with 1930s Germany. Being a Nazi is bad, but in most fantasy media, the protagonists always risk their lives to redeem one. Draco, Jasper, the Diamonds, which is mind-boggling, not to mention the number of pages the writer spends teaching the reader about the ideology of this fictional Nazi. Ultimately, the trope can work, but it can just as easily fail the next generation of fantasy nerds as it has already failed our generation. Evidence of this failure is in AO3, with all of those redeemed Nazis being in fact fiction, where they get to be happy after spending their lives being a menace, and calling them a menace is putting it lightly. So what now? I have pointed out how those type of men come about. The type of men who love to see themselves as heroic but are always aggressive to women. Incels who view anything different from themselves as an abomination, a mistake made by God that needs correcting. But that begs the question, what should we do about it? Do we police what young men watch when they are at their most vulnerable, when they are on the cusp of puberty? But then again, who gets to decide what is appropriate? Their parents? There are ways for teens to go around their parents entirely when it comes to media they choose to consume. If we want to police them, it would have to be a societal decision. But again, who gets to decide? Should we introduce better media for men to consume? Except better media already exists. It's just that the average boy won't even know it exists or want to read it. Look at the Sadie Carter series by Rick Riordan, where the main protagonists are two biracial siblings with magic in modern times. It is a beautiful book filled with action and love, and they have great comics. But most boys I grew up with who read fantasy completely ignored them and chose to favor the one with the white protagonist who has a white savior complex, aka Percy Jackson. No hate to Percy Jackson. I did love the series, but I don't think I get to say that I love the series of Percy Jackson because my favorite character in the Percy Jackson series was Bianca D'Angelo and Zoe Nightshade. I myself would not have known about the wonderful series that is the Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin if it weren't for a random man on YouTube hyping her up. And I pride myself on being a somewhat encyclopedia of fun books to read. You should genuinely see my TBR list. Maybe that's the solution. Maybe we need a better sense of community, a newer and more improved version of book talk, one that caters to all audience, not just dark romance girlies. Maybe that is the path to better behave fantasy nerds. We could potentially apply the same thing to film and TV shows, as maybe we as a society could start hyping up the good pieces of your media that foster empathy and critical thinking skills in our young men, instead of books that solely act as escapism fantasy. Because at some point, the boys will need to come back to reality. And if all they have absorbed from a piece of media is that boys are better than girls, I fear our society is doomed. If you have any recommendations on how we could potentially steer more fantasy readers away from the alt-right pipeline, please put them in the comments, because I fear we have come to the end of the video. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel, because I will be releasing more videos in the coming days. Also, I would like to just say Happy New Year's!